Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for a fireside chat. Welcome to this gathering, this discussion hosted by the Committee of 100, Extraordinary Chinese Americans, Ensuring Full Inclusion in America and Advancing U.S.-China Relations. It is great to be here tonight, along with our great fireside chatter, and that's Randi Weingarten. This is the Fireside Chat on Reopening America's Schools during COVID with AFT President Randi Weingarten. And you are an organization that represents, 1.7 million teachers and more. And the focus today, Randi, as I said in the title, is to really talk about that topic that no matter who you are, if you've got kids, you got more questions than answers, right? And I'm not saying that you're going to have all the answers, and that's okay if you don't. I'm still going to ask the questions, right? For those of you who are joining us right now, thank you for being here. We will later be streaming this, so you can rewatch it if you have any questions or you're not sure that you heard exactly what was said. Not necessarily to make fun of us, we hope, but instead to really listen carefully to what Randi's going to tell us. You can also, throughout this conversation, under the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A section. Many of you are familiar with that. Go ahead and put your questions in there, and Randi and I will get to them throughout the next hour. We surely do hope that you feel free to express yourselves. Feel free to share your questions. Randi, how are you?
I'm good, Richard. Thank God everybody is okay in my circles these days. Not so much in March or in April, but right now, thank God everybody's okay. And how are you?
Well, good. You know, as an anchor fella over there at MSNBC on weekends, it's been very busy and working hard on getting the facts straight, as you know. And
As someone who watches MSNBC, probably it's on the TV at all times in my house. So yes, you guys, you have been formidable, fearless, and really, you know, the First Amendment obligations of the press, MSNBC takes seriously, and I'm very grateful for that.
yeah, the NBC route's definitely true. I'm also a member of the Committee of 100, so I thank you for coming to hang with us.
Great.
And so, Randi, you know, I was looking at the map of states, you know, and how they're deciding whether to open or not. For those of us who aren't staring at the map, who don't know what all of the different teacher associations are doing locally, what's happening? What are you watching across the country?
So let me just start by showing a very well-worn copy of a plan that we put out on April 29th. And as you and I were talking earlier,
Yeah.
I spent most of, you know, the first weeks of COVID in New York. So April 29th was still in the height of what New York City was going through. And this plan was about how do we reopen schools safely, not whether, but how, knowing full well that, and I'm very delighted and honored to be with the Committee of 100 today, and I want to get back to that in a minute, but it was, we know how important in-school learning is. We knew that, you know, on March 10th, and we know that on September 2nd. And so the issue for us was how to listen to the scientists. I'm a social studies teacher and a lawyer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. So how to listen to the epidemiologists and the virologists.
Well, we still like you.
Disease docs. Say it again.
We still like you, even though you're not.
Know, probably for being a teacher, not a lawyer, but thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's like, you know, you have to listen to the scientists, particularly when you're in the first worldwide pandemic in a century that has had this kind of effect. And what we learned then is as important today as it was in April. And it will tell you a lot about the map in terms of who can and can't open. So there's like three big buckets of things you have to think about. Number one is you have to tackle community spread. If you have a certain amount, and WHO, World Health Organization, and CDC both say about 5%. If you have more than 5% of community spread of COVID, then you don't have it under control and you really can't reopen things that are inside. And that is something that even Dr. Birx, when she was allowed to speak, has said. That's what Dr. Fauci has said. And that's what governors who are sentient individuals are saying. So that's one threshold. The second is you have to actually be able to, well, let me start it this way, that because 40% of spread is asymptomatic, if you don't have a testing, tracing, and isolation infrastructure, and now we've learned we have to have it around schools if we don't have it in a community, then you do not, then if there is a spread, you find out only too late if you don't have that infrastructure. So you need that infrastructure in place to be able to monitor, be able to surveil, be able to really track what is going on in a community, or like South Korea is doing, in a country. Number three, you have to have, as I call it, the big six. Even CDC still has these safeguards embedded in their guidance, even as they've loosened other guidance. And that is the mask and physical distancing, the cleaning and ventilation, reasonable accommodation for those who are at risk, and obviously washing of one's hands. So if you think about just the safety issues, then you look at the map, and the first thing you see in the map is that basically those places that have more than 5% community spread, with the exception of, I would say, Arizona and Florida, all those places that have more than 5% community spread, those schools have gone on remote. And then in terms of the second issue, meaning the testing and all those safeguards, this is where resources come into play big time. If a state hasn't had the capacity to put testing in place, or a city or locality, and if they don't have the resources to get even masks or soap so you can wash your hands, or kids can wash their hands, or resources to get the MERV 13s so you can change the filter systems in offices or in schools, or have enough custodial work this summer so you can open windows and have a fan in a classroom, then those places are opening on remote as well. What you're also saying is that most of the bigger school districts in America, you heard them say in June, July, and August, you heard the word hybrid a lot. And the reason you heard the word hybrid a lot is because most of us don't think hybrid is the best plan, but in order to actually create a plan that has 6 feet of physical distancing between people, children and adults alike, that essentially meant you had to have the number of kids in a school, or find double the number of teachers and double the number of space. So the resource question essentially made doubling the number of teachers impossible, and the fact that we don't have space or tents or whatever made doubling the number of space impossible. So that's why you heard so many districts, in May, June, July, start talking hybrid. But many of them started remotely because they didn't have even if they were under the 5%, they didn't have the testing infrastructure, and they didn't have the safeguards to actually prevent transmission in schools. So if you know and follow the science, that's why you're seeing that about 39 of the 50 largest school districts have actually started remotely. And New York City is pretty much the only major school district that is trying to figure out how to be in person for a piece of time. And that is now about to happen because of the deal that the principals union and the teachers union made with Mayor de Blasio this week. It's not a done deal because the schools still have to get ready, but you have now Governor Cuomo saying New York City, New York State, under 5%. So that first gate threshold is met. And now you have to make sure the nitty gritty of preventing transmission of a very dangerous disease is met before you have in-school learning.
Do you have a number? You brought up New York State, 10 in 100,000 in the last 7 days on average is the number before you can travel into the state of New York, for instance, without self-quarantining. When it comes to school districts or schools, it is because that's the data that's readily available, right, to many of the parents out there today. They can check and probably find what the number of cases per 100,000 are.
Right.
What's that number where you feel comfortable that children can go back to school physically?
So the number for us is the same thing. It has to be a transmission rate of basically less than 1% a day. So it's basically 10 in 100,000, and you have to have that transparency. In terms of community, it's basically 5%, but in terms of the day-to-day transmission, it's basically 1%, which is the same thing. And I give Governor Cuomo a lot of credit because transparency is really important in terms of New York State. Compare that to a state like Florida that is above 5% community spread, meaning it's above basically 5% of, so it's basically 50 of 100,000. It's basically above that. And yet they refuse to disclose the numbers anymore in terms of schooling. So you wonder, why are they denying COVID exists and then refusing to disclose so that parents and teachers don't really know what's going on?
What is the model for the future based on what we're learning today? Is it a model where at any day of any week, or any week of any month, or any month of any year, that a school or a school district can flip to hybrid or flip to complete remote, back to physical, in person? Is there a discussion about that flexibility on
Yes.
the fly, if you will?
Yes. I mean, look, I was on Governor Cuomo's reopening task force. I was the union representative. And, I think it's part of, even though I am a national labor leader, my home is New York, and, I never stray far away from my home. And so one of the things that we pushed for as that commission, and that is embedded to some extent in the Department of Health guidelines, is this kind of closing and reopening criteria. It's not really as fully formed as it probably should be, because no one really wants to have to deal with closing and opening. But this is part of the reason why testing is so important. We have to prevent an outbreak from becoming a surge. And we have to prevent what happened in March again in a place, in the United States. I don't think there is an appetite anywhere in the United States for a closure like what happened in March and April.
Right.
We're already having
Right.
a problem in terms of the states having a 20% cut to their budgets, and having so many small businesses on the brink and things like that. So if you don't have the testing that is able to monitor what the COVID, how much COVID is in a locality or a region, and you don't actually understand that in that going inside
Hmm.
is one of the big super spreaders. So ultimately, in my judgment, obviously, well, nothing is obvious about this moment, but in my judgment, if you had a school that all of a sudden had what you saw in Georgia, that or what you saw in Martin County, Florida, that within the first week of schools restarting, 5 schools had COVID cases of the 23, and Martin County is right by Palm Beach County, there
Hmm.
should be an SOS. There should be something is wrong with this. And if you had done the isolation, the tracing and the isolation, which they should have done in Florida, but they didn't, you would have been able to get to the bottom of it. Just like with that wedding that happened in Maine, they have a good enough tracing and isolation process. But you
Hmm.
saw that in the absence of that, it became a super spreading event. Schools can become super spreading events if you don't be very careful about the data. So, back of the envelope, what they're doing in New York City right now is if there's one case and they've had a pod in a classroom, they will close that classroom and they will have everyone in that classroom, teacher and children included, on quarantine for the 10 or 14 days. But if there's 2 cases in a school in 2 different classrooms, and the school maybe had 10 classrooms, then that is a real warning sign that you may have to close the whole school. Our position as a union is 2 different classrooms within the same day or two, you better really close the school, not just wash the school down, so that you create confidence for parents and teachers in the community that we are containing the virus. And so, but in other places, they will make different decisions. I think that in the short term, it's really important to give educators and parents confidence that going indoor is not going to become super spreading events. And you saw that colleges actually have made a different decision. University of North Carolina, they closed down for the semester. Temple just decided to do something different. They decided to close down for 2 weeks to see if they could use that period of time as quarantine and then start over. Oneonta, one of the SUNY colleges, decided to close for the semester because there was too much evidence of COVID on that campus. And there was a real concern that it would then create an outbreak in upstate New York. So the problem is we're not done with COVID. We're not, and the denials and the disinformation on the federal government side has made this worse. South Korea sees an increased incidence, and so they just this week or last week closed their schools. They have a national testing strategy that's monitoring all this. So they
Yeah,
will open and close and open and close. The problem in
and so
America, I'm sorry.
yeah. So continue to build on that. The question I wanted to ask Randy then, what is, if you had to divide it and succinctly say, what are the 3 or 5 steps to reopening? And if each step had a headline, what would those headlines be?
One, tackle community spread. 2, have the testing and and tracing and infrastructure in place so that an outbreak doesn't become a surge. And number 3, you have to have the safeguards in a school that prevent spread, as I call them, the big 6.
The big six, as you mentioned earlier, that's right. What's the data about that you've looked into, looking at students specifically here, how the younger age group versus older age groups are affected and either contract and or spread COVID? What's the number or the data point you're watching in that space?
So this is, and we had Dr. Fauci on a town hall with us in, I think, late July. And one thing he said which stuck with me, is that we have to be humble about the research because, no one says it anymore, but they used to say novel coronavirus because this is a new virus and we're learning, or the scientists are learning more every day. So the Academy of Pediatricians, who initially thought that there was very little spread amongst younger kids or among kids generally, just put out a study at the end of August, which essentially was the opposite of their original conclusions. And that study showed that that younger kids, that study showed that there were 70,000 infections in children in the last 2-3 weeks of August. And that was alarming. And that study also showed that younger kids, or there was, I think, a Harvard study that they built on that showed that younger kids, while thankfully more resilient to illness, contained in their nostrils about 10 times as much virus as older kids or adults. So that younger kids, even though thank God they don't get as sick, except for what we saw with the syndromes in New York and in some other places in March or April, that younger kids can be, as, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it, as effective spreaders as older kids and as adults. And then the South Korea study showed that older kids will spread as much as adults. So the earlier instinct and information that you hear all the time on Fox, my apologies for raising another station with you, Richard, but on Fox and
Never heard of them.
from Donald Trump and from Betsy DeVos, that don't worry because kids are not problematic, that's false. Kids can spread, kids can get disease, kids can die.
One of the was written into us, I wanted to ask you this, was a concern about focusing on getting kids back into school in person, and that the AFT and the NEA have not been focused enough about how to physically get them back or what that path is, and instead looking at teachers' interests. Understandably, it's who you represent here, but of course, there's the kids themselves too. What would you say to that question?
So, number one, it's completely false. That's why I waved this study around from April. Before anybody else was talking about this, we were talking about how to get kids back to school and how to do it safely. Number two, I think it is pretty unconscionable to try to pit life versus learning. Learning happens when we provide a safe and welcoming environment for children. And when people start talking about how, because children don't get COVID, first off, that's false. But when they were saying, well, children don't get it as much, so we shouldn't be concerned with the adults who are working with children because the needs of children to mitigate their social isolation is so great that their teachers are dispensable. And if you just think about that sentence, no one should be dispensable. We need to focus on both teachers' lives and children's lives. And think about it. How is it that a teacher is actually really going to be able to teach if he or she is so concerned with whether or not he or she or they are bringing home COVID at home? So we've actually been very concerned about how to make things safe and how to make sure that we can get kids back to learning. We wouldn't have been this fixated on all of these things, including getting kids back to school, if we weren't this concerned. We know that remote learning doesn't work well. We know it is not a substitute for in-school learning, but this is basically part of this constant lack of knowledge or understanding that teachers actually want what kids need, and that this is about ensuring that communities can actually reopen safely. If we had attacked the virus as effectively as others had done, we wouldn't be in a situation where people were trying to pit teachers against children.
Randy, and to all those who are with us, thanks for joining us again. We're at the halfway point here with a fireside chat
That was a
sponsored by the
little
Committee of
theory of me, I'm
100.
sorry.
Oh, no problem. Reopening America's schools during COVID. We have with us AFT President Randi Weingarten, who represents a couple of teachers, I hear. So when we look at your questions, folks, you can put them in the Q&A section and I'll get straight to them. And in fact, we do have a question from an anonymous attendee. And this questioner says, do you think the schools can change mid-semester, or will it remain the same for the year? Just asking in terms of any adjustment. This goes back to
Oh, of
my
course
question
there's going to
earlier.
be.
Will they be able
Look,
to?
I hope there's going to be adjustments, and I'm hoping, for example, like I'll take Newark, for example. Newark did everything right. Newark tried, I over the summer had proposed we had summer school this summer in places we could, so we could try doing some ways of seeing the protocols that are important to keep people safe. And Newark was one of those places, and keep kids learning. So that was my proposal, to have summer school, just in reference to the last question, when somebody thinks that teacher unions are not actually trying to get kids back into schools. And Newark tried. They had some summer school programs that were online. They had some summer school programs that were in person. They had some COVID cases. They closed the programs down. They reopened them after cleaning and after some quarantining. But Newark really was, and every single school in Newark was ready to reopen in a hybrid model. And then the mayor, and I respect this mayor hugely, Ras Baraka has done an incredible job. The mayor went on TV and said, look, it's not safe. And if it's not, and I'm asking parents to basically opt in for remote education instead of in person, because it's really not safe right now in Newark. So as you can imagine, then teachers were saying, well, if it's not safe, how can we go into schools? And you saw within about a week period of time that the Newark school system went from proposing in person to going to remote for the first semester. The first semester, because we know if the country is in a better situation, if we have a vaccine, or
Right.
if we have been able to really contain the virus, there's an ability to reopen, earlier than the year. I am not giving up on this year being, all remote. We will do everything we can as a union to fight for the resources, and to, fight for the testing, and to try to create situations where we can reopen
Right.
on a hybrid basis in person.
And so I've got two more questions from our participants. I did want to ask you, what are the teachers doing today that has made them better teachers because of what they're going through?
I would say empathy, compassion, we're all in it together. I would say that the whole issue, one of the things that I think people are seeing, there's two areas I would go into. One is, even though COVID has affected people differently, what's happened is that the whole country has gone through it. And whereas
The whole world.
the whole world, exactly, the whole world has gone through it. My apologies. but the sense that those first few weeks of not knowing what was going on, I watched teachers from around the country and frankly around the world find ways of engaging students and calming their students down and calming their students' families down and finding hope and light in a very, very scary
And
and
that's important.
unknowable
That's right.
situation.
Yeah.
And that was that's one of the most amazing things that I saw. And I saw it in places like New York, where we lost because New York City closed too late. There were over 150 educators who died of COVID. They're members of mine who we lost because they did not know what was going on
Right.
and the virus spread too much. That's
And
number one.
oh, that's number one. Okay, go ahead and do number
Number
two.
two is that teachers are very ingenious. They are very intuitive, and they are, if you give them the freedom to teach, they're going to try a whole bunch of different things. So frankly, teachers actually know more right now about remote instruction than K-12 Inc. or than pretty much anyone but maybe Sal Khan and Sal Khan's Academy. Because what teachers had to do in March, April, and May is they had to essentially make it up as they were going on. And they learned a lot. The dilemma is there's so much fixation on the logistics of this, and the states are so much on their own that we have not yet really we've collected a lot of promising practices, but not best practices. So if you go to our Share My Lesson site, which any parent, any member of Committee of 100 can go on, we've made it free for everyone. You see, it is filled with a lot of what we think is promising instructional practices that teachers have learned about how to do distance learning in a way that engages and is meaningful to
Yeah.
students.
And I've seen that. We've done stories on it on our network. There is the question, and when I talk to colleagues around the country, is the health of children going to school in person versus staying at home, and the potential benefit, and as well the concern, what is not positive, potential, harm, potential situations that are not positive for the student, for the child. How do you talk about the health of the child when they have to stay at home versus going to the school? And those are, two different, very
Well, how do you
difficult
do
choices.
that? How do you do that when schools are closed over the summer as well? I mean, how do you do that in any situation like after 3 o'clock in the afternoon? I mean, the issue is this. This is not a good situation for children. This is not a good situation for America. There's a lot of real problems about social isolation. But we have to create, the question becomes, what comes first? Do we protect the health and safety of people first, and and take what is the understanding that we are in a pandemic, or do we actually pretend that that isn't there?
What do you
And
tell parents?
what?
What do you tell parents on, because that's the question going through their
Well,
mind all
parents.
the time, right?
Well, I mean, it's agonizing for everyone, and many teachers are parents, and we have these. We spend a lot of time with parents, and basically parents and teachers right now, in every poll, we're in the field right now with many of our parent partners doing polling of parents, and what we're seeing is that Black and brown parents in particular are as concerned about these issues as educators are, because they don't want to see their kids they don't want to see learning pit against living. But but one of the reasons that we have tried to figure out how to do these hybrid situations is because we know in-school learning is important. But the issue becomes, what is more important? Is it more important to protect the life of people, or is it more important to basically ignore those factors and just pretend that nothing is different? And that's and we're going to see, unfortunately, a big experiment around this, unfortunately, because Florida, Georgia, Arizona have opted to say it's more important for parents to go back to work. And so they are ignoring the community spread. They are ignoring the issues around COVID. So unfortunately, we're going to see in real time what happens. My obligation as both someone who is a school teacher who wants kids desperately to be in school and who is a union leader is to try and make sure that we fight the virus, make schools as safe as we possibly can so that we can open them. And if we can't, make sure that remote education is stood up in a way that's good.
Randy, one of the things that comes up, and we're getting towards the last quarter of the time we've got together, so rapid fire if we can, as we hit the last bit. This has exacerbated the gap in technology for certain groups of our America. Those who do not have the resources, do not have the technology at home, this has really put them they're already disadvantaged. They've been pushed farther back during this time. What's some of the ideas and solutions that you are thinking of, that you are pushing forward at AFT?
Right, and the other thing is, before we end, I just want to make sure I thanks Committee of 100 for all the PPE. So I just don't want to forget that, Richard. But so there's 4 ideas that we have. First off, there's this E-rate program in the federal government. It's part of what we have pushed for in terms of the HEROES Act and any stimulus, which essentially means that every parent everywhere and every child everywhere should have free access to the internet, not just to a device or a hotspot, but actually access to reliable broadband. And that will require, in some rural areas, standing up broadband. But frankly, in cities and suburbia all throughout the country, broadband is accessible, but the connectivity companies, the cable companies, have not waived their charges to make sure that it's free for children and for parents. So that's number 1. Number 2, we have to make sure in even a hybrid situation, we get devices, not smartphones, but devices like a laptop or other things to kids, and not just one per family, but make sure that any child who is in school has access to a real computer so that they have the ability to do the various things. And there are now long waits. Dell has long waits. Apple has long waits in order to actually get this computer equipment.
How long are the waits that you know of, Randy? Do you know how long they are?
The last time I asked somebody a couple of days ago, I've heard that districts are having like a 4 to 8 week wait, which one wonders, given that we had the summer, what happened here. But you have a chicken and egg situation where districts were waiting for the resources from the stimulus bill. The stimulus bill never happened. They're going to dig in more into reserves that they don't have. Right. What happens? Do they buy these resources and cut teachers? So those are the conversations that are going on in districts.
Right.
So the digital divide is huge. Number 2.
Number 3 and 4, and then I've got 12 questions out here, and I want to make sure to get to. Give me number 3 and 4.
feeding. We tried to actually open up school kitchens all summer long. We couldn't get the resources from the feds to do it, so that we were feeding America, not just feeding kids. We need to make more fulsome use of school cafeterias, particularly with food insecurity and with 30 million people unemployed. Number three, there is something that we've done in the past that we need to broaden. Community schools, wrap services around, really deal with the social isolation, the other issues that kids have, finding ways that we can create this virtually or group experiences so that we can get our, really see our kids and make sure that we are meeting their other needs.
All right, we got to number 4. So I've got, if you could answer each of these in 30 seconds, that would be great. Keith is asking this. He says, many of these, the 50 largest school districts are in states where indoor dining is happening and allowed. What do you say, what answer do you have for parents who don't see the difference between the indoor dining and their kids attending school? 30 seconds.
I would ask them to be in a classroom with youngsters who have minds of their own about wearing masks and about social distancing. Part and parcel of this is that we have to make sure we create routines for kids so that we keep them safe.
So do you see that as similar or dissimilar?
It's very different when you have 2 to 4 people at a dining room table, and if somebody is acting out, the restaurant owner can say, you need to leave, versus a teacher and kids in a classroom where you have to make sure that we are developing the routines that are necessary so that we keep kids safe, we keep their masks on, we keep them physically distant.
Got it. All right, 30 seconds. Adam is asking this. Do you have confidence that students will generally adhere to safety protocols to keep schools safe?
So
good luck.
That's kind of the opposite of the first question, which is, look, I think if we can create the routines, but that's part of the reason why we've said, let's reopen schools in places that we can, slowly, responsibly, and create those routines for kids. We create routines for kids about putting their boots on. We create routines for kids about getting their books. I'm talking about younger kids. I'm not talking about older kids. But these are new routines we're going to have to create with making sure that they wash their hands and they wear their masks. And we'll find ditties and we'll find songs and we'll find ways of doing this. But this is what we're going to have to do. That's part of the learning and the changing
right.
that we have to do in schools.
And so is that a yes, you have confidence, or no, you don't, or it's a maybe?
It is, to borrow an overused expression, it is what it is.
It is what it is.
The fact is we're trying. We're going to need to try. I have confidence in teachers being able to do this. But that's why reopening schools has to be, gradual and responsible.
This question comes from Jung Yu, who's the leader of C100. So this is a question straight to you, Randy. Can you describe the key difference between private and public schools when it comes to COVID preparedness and the discrepancies or the differences in some of their responses, right?
Well, look, I've seen several private schools that have, for example, vast plots of property, and they've been able to put tents up, and they've been able to actually hire more teachers, do the social distancing, have pods, and they've had the space and the resources to do this. And I'm like, fabulous, except for the obvious issues of equity. I wish we could all do that. But you just saw, for example, Success Academy in New York is staying on remote for 3 months because they don't have the space and they don't have the additional teachers, and we need to keep people safe. So you've had different reactions dependent upon the resources that people have had and the ability to use those resources, including space. The other thing that happened is that unlike public schools, private schools were able to get PPP as part of the CARES Act, and many private schools actually dipped into that and were able to do it. I'm not blaming them. I think it's great that they were able to get that, but we need to have the resources for public schools, and that's part of the stimulus that is yet to be.
30 seconds, we're going to get into cold. Fall comes upon us, and then winter. Any sort of outdoor classes go away in this scenario. 30 seconds, what do you suggest? What is the AFT's view on that in terms of how to combat that dynamic?
So this is part of the reason why making sure, as I call it, those big six are so important to ensure that you have decent ventilation in schools. This is an airborne disease, making sure that we have the, the other protocols in place so that we can have so that we can be in school in the fall and the winter.
Anonymous, but the question no less, is the AFT worried about possibly having kids having to repeat grades because online learning potentially is less effective than in person?
Of course, we are worried about, look, first off, I'm Jewish, so I worry about everything all the time anyway. But secondly, of course, we're worried about all of this. I mean, there are no good solutions here. The issue is we're trying the best we can because the kids who have grown up in this this is going to be the experience that molds the kids who have grown up in this.
Now, do you think it's going to, that teaching, now that it's become more at home, and that has certainly been, my mother being a lifelong teacher, definitely dealt through the different decades of the way teaching and culture evolve. Now that you're having more homeschooling in place, parents there one-on-one, might it be the opposite in some cases? As opposed to less efficacy, you might see higher efficacy in some cases.
I would say that that's probably true. In some cases, you probably will see, you'll see different relationships that have developed between parents and their kids, and that develop between teachers and their kids. This year will be really different than last year, because last year we at least had the relationships with our kids. It's part of the reason that many of us really wanted to reopen school. I can't, if there's something that the Committee of 100 takes from this, we want to reopen school buildings. We know it's really important. And if the scientists were not as concerned about the fact that there has been 187,000 people who have died and 6.1 million people affected and infected, and there's no effective therapeutics yet, and there's no vaccine yet, this is part of the issue that nobody wants to play Russian roulette with people's lives. And so that's why the resources for these kind of safety mechanisms and safeguards are so important. But one of the only silver linings that there are, Richard, and I know we have to go, is that people see public schooling now as center to communities. And that in schooling or in school, in-person schooling, the relationships that are built, the communities that are created, there is much more of an acknowledgement about how important that is. So I am hopeful that when we get to a vaccine or effective therapeutics, we're going to see a huge resurgence of the need for public schooling as a center of communities and the need for community building.
I've got 5 more minutes with you. I'm going to squeeze every drop of water out of this. You can bet. So 30 seconds again, Randy. Play with me. Stay with me here. How are you helping parents become better teachers' aides? How are you helping parents become better teachers' aides? 30 seconds.
I think that there has to be real communication between teachers and parents, and about the work. You know, teaching is a skill. It's a science, it's an art, it's a skill of communication, and it's an understanding of content. And you know, parents, it's a different job than a parent's job. And so we have to give each other a little bit of patience and a little bit of grace around this.
So what's your one sentence piece of advice to parents as they think about how to become better teachers' aides? What's your one piece of
Be
in a sentence?
patient with your kids.
Okay, count to 10. Victoria asks this question: what has AFT proposed that school maintenance staffs use in their protocol for disinfecting and cleaning? 30 seconds.
There is an OSHA-based cleaning that has to have, I think it's 60 to 80% alcohol-based. I don't have the specifics in my head, but there are protocols for that, and we can get that to you.
For high school
protocol
seniors,
I have in my head is MERV 13 filters.
There you go. There you go. For high school seniors, Randy, when they're trying to make the transition to university, what are teachers doing differently to make sure that seniors are able to make this transition effectively? Not necessarily reopening, but if you can answer that.
So one of the things we saw, one of the most effective practices we saw last year is something that's going to help high school seniors make the transition to college, which is getting into the practice of doing capstone projects, not teaching to the test, not being good test takers, but being able to put a project together either individually or in a group, being able to write about it, being able to talk about it, being able to defend it. And that's the kind of teaching, that kind of project-based instruction that will be helpful in terms of the transition as well.
The changes being implemented right now, Randy, there's another group. We talked about those who are economically disadvantaged, right? And you had 4 points related to that. What about those who have special needs and disabilities? How are they being accommodated right now? What are you watching? And I'm sorry again, 30 seconds, please.
So this is who, frankly, this is the group of students that I worry about the most, because for many of them, virtual doesn't work. What we've tried to do is, and this is why it's really important to keep paraprofessionals on staff, we have to actually do some of this work as if there were educators and paraprofessionals are essential workers that may have to go to students' homes. We're going to have to actually, when we reopen schools, and it's going to be a terrible look, a paraprofessional may have to have an entire gown on and all that PPE on to make sure that that a student is accommodated. But I am really worried about our special needs kids. It's part of what pushed me to actually push for summer school this summer to make sure that we could actually address the needs of special needs children.
We got 4 questions left in 2 minutes. You and I can do this, Randy. The Secretary of Education says that more federal funding should be redirected to charter and church schools because public schools have become, words of the questioner here, James, nothing more than a wasteful receptacle for the hopeless. How does AFT engage and work with the Secretary based on these sorts of comments?
You can't work with the Secretary of Education. I tried. I brought her to 3 public schools in Van Wert, Ohio in April of 2017. And, you know, and she made a lot of promises to the parents that she saw there, to the teachers she saw there, and to me, and she didn't fulfill any of those. She has a right to believe in religious education. Look, I'm married to a rabbi. I believe in religion. I go to Shabbos services every Friday night. But, you know, there is a big difference between what, you know, the public should pay for and shouldn't pay for. And that debate will happen some other time. But at the end of the day, the Secretary of Education has to be the secretary for all kids, 90% of whom go to public schools. And so the people who are trying to do the funding of cities like Trump is trying to do right now, the funding of schools like the Secretary of Education has tried to do. It's just not appropriate for somebody in that position.
30 seconds if you can, because I want to make it to the end here. And I really appreciate you, Randy, again, spending the time with us. We might go 1 minute over. Where's a space where you might be able to work with the secretary?
As I said, I tried.
Yeah.
I tried in April of 2017. I told her that I would go to a school of her choice. I couldn't go the day she wanted to go, and she hasn't been in touch with us ever since. She locked us out of the Department of Education. We tried to actually give her some feedback. It's just, that's not her thing. And ultimately, she's the first person, I know this is more than 30 seconds, but I was the president of the teachers union in New York City during 9/11. Rudy Giuliani and I worked together to get pension funds to prop up the city. We worked together to reopen schools. He and I didn't agree on anything, but in a crisis, you work together. Margaret Spellings and I worked together. Arnie Duncan and we worked together. Rod Page and we worked together. During a crisis, you work together. You put away partisan politics, but they have not put a plan out. They have not put guidance out. They have not put resources out. The only thing they try to do is undermine. And frankly, you can't work with that. You just got to call that out and try to do the best you can do with others.
So many single parents out there really on their heels at the moment, because as you know, that reduces the time frame or the time available, right, to work with their children if they're working in that environment on top of that, depending whether they do leave the house. What do you say to single parents?
We are trying to create mentoring programs. We're trying to create, lots of different ways. That's why I'm a big believer in community schools. We have put them together. Jeff Canada has put them together as a way of trying to create other supports, both virtually as well as in person, to the extent that we can do that. This is, this is a terrible situation for virtually everyone. We have to make sure we are all in it together.
Last question, and thank you again, Randi. What's the
You're
good that's what's the good that's going to come from this for teachers and students?
Well, look at the one, and this is my gratefulness to the Committee of 100. Look, we represent over 200,000 essential workers who've been working in hospitals during this whole period of time, many of whom did not have the appropriate PPE. I've never tried to source goods from China. I had to try to figure out how to do that. And then frankly, the Committee of 100 helped us in many different ways. They help workers who are in meatpacking industries. They help my workers, our nurses, our respiratory therapists. They just were able to get us 100,000 N95s. One of the goods that come out of this is how you build community with people you would not have ordinarily worked together with. We have to build community. Martin Luther King said in his last book, he raised the question, chaos or community? I believe we have to build community. And if we build community, and if we have each other's back, just like in the aftermath of World War II, we were a stronger country. There were lots of things that happened that were terrible in World War II, but we were a stronger country that happened afterwards. And I am hoping, frankly, with different leadership in the country, we can be a stronger country, and that people who have been through this, every child, every teacher, every person who's been through COVID is going to remember this moment. And if we can find the hope and the optimism from it instead of the darkness, we're going to be better off.
AFT President Randi Weingarten for our fireside chat today on reopening America's schools during COVID-19. Thank you so much, Randi, for being with us today for the Committee of 100's event, and appreciate your work. Again, as a son of a retired teacher, we need all the help we can get, right? And we need all support we can get when it comes to teaching in America. So thank you, Randi, and go out and have a great evening and spending part of it with us. To all of you who spent time with us, it will be, all of this conversation will be streamed and you can watch it on demand as you like. Just follow the Committee of 100 social channels. On behalf of Randy and myself, you all have a good night.